Today, it brings me tremendous pleasure to present the first episode of Season 4, and what a season it's going to be. Over the next 7 weeks, we're going to dive into phonics, professional development, mathematics, school leadership, special educational needs, and today, motivation with one of the brightest minds in the world of education. We want to keep TDAPE advert-free so that our recommendations remain impartial and born of genuine interest and inspiration. But things like Zoom, the primary mode of episode recording, won't be free forever. To help support the podcast, you can subscribe at ko-fi.com/TDAPE by choosing one of 3 different subscription levels, each of which will provide you with access to episode transcripts, priority episode requests, monthly CPD videos, or even all of the above. To show your support, visit ko-fi.com/TDAPE. That's ko-fi.com/TDAPE. There's no expectation that you do subscribe, but we hope that it'll be worth your while if you do. Now, this week, we have a guest who needs no introduction. Despite enjoying success as an engineer, mathematics teacher, and dean of the Ambition Institute, Peps Mccrae is best known as the author of his ultra-concise books for teachers and the go-to for all things motivation. Referenced regularly from episodes 1 to 53 and everything in between, it was nothing short of an honor to interview Peps. So without further ado, let's spend some time thinking deeply about primary education. So today I'm joined by Peps Mccrae. Hi Peps, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Kieran. Excited to be on the podcast today.
And we're going to focus our attention on motivation. And I think my first question to you, Peps, is do our pupils need to be motivated?
So I think, based on my read of the literature and my experience, I would say that yes. I suppose, right. Let me strip back a little bit first. So your question, do pupils need to be motivated? What's the real question there? And so I suppose the real question is, should it be a teacher's responsibility to build motivation in the classroom? Because I think the answer to, should pupils be motivated is an easy one. Yes, like we all should be motivated, ideally. I suppose there's questions around motivated towards what that we can dig into a little bit as well, because there's also anyway, okay, so you open a good like box of can of worms here, box of beans, whatever it is. So first, let's start with one of those questions, which is, do we think it's responsibility of teachers to build some kind of motivation for their pupils in school? And I'd say the answer is yes. And I think the reason is because, well, there's a few reasons that we can kind of chuck in here. The first is that whenever researchers, and there's been a few studies that have looked at this, whenever like researchers look at motivation, people's levels of motivation across their school career, they basically see this like inexorable decline over the years. So that's like, artifact number one, as it were. Motivation seems to decline across the school career. Now, there are a few explanations for that, or a few hypothesized explanations for that. The first is that the narrowing of the curriculum across a school career means that for many pupils, it's basically less motivating. An alternative hypothesis is that like the development of young people into adolescence, just that kind of like biological journey, and the context that they're in during that time, basically like lowers their levels of motivation for school context learning during that period. However, those are the 2 hypotheses that kind of fall into the literature. However, I'd say like my own hypothesis would be that those 2 both have an impact, but there's a third thing, which is also that schools could potentially be doing a better job of motivating their pupils. And I feel really bad saying that. It's like saying, teachers aren't doing a good enough job. But so to be really clear here, like teachers are amazing, really smart, incredibly hardworking. But as a profession and as a society, we just don't understand motivation well enough yet. All right. So it's like nobody's fault here. Like nobody's not trying hard enough. Nobody's not smart enough. It's just that as a system, as a society, and as a profession, we just haven't really got a strong enough understanding of what motivation is and how to influence it yet, so that we can kind of like alter that trajectory through the course of school. And part of that, or the reason we don't have that that knowledge, I suppose, as it were, yet, is because it's a really hard thing to research, and so that we don't actually have the evidence base to support motivation is, for example, nowhere near as strong as the evidence base around concise. Right? And we know like the evidence base around concise, lots of questions around it, and motivation is like, if concise is nice, like, gleaming skyscraper of like evidence, then the evidence around motivation is just a really old creaky shed. It really is nowhere near as robust. Loads of replication issues and just massive incoherence in terms of like the language that's used to underpin the evidence base. The research is spread across multiple fields. There isn't a really strong like cohering field that pulls it all together. So yeah, that's the reason why we don't necessarily have like a strong core knowledge base to draw upon as the profession, and because of that, then we don't necessarily have the tools or language yet to be able to motivate our pupils perhaps as much as we could do. And as a result, I think we see this like decline in motivation over school, or it's one of the factors that leads to that, which is why I think we as a profession probably do need to take a bit of responsibility over helping pupils to be more motivated. And one of the ways we can do that is by just learning as much as we can from the evidence, despite its shaky status, because like kids' future lives is a bit too important just to kind of be left until the research figures itself out.
Yeah, I know what you mean, because when you mention other fields, I'm thinking about sports in particular, and you get a lot of possibly survivorship bias, where people who've been really fortunate as well as really talented, it's their motivation that gets analyzed, and you're almost thinking, well, this isn't necessarily the best subset of the population to sort of go to.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And the same's been true of some like business analysis as well. The great companies or great leaders in companies, that have done these things. But yeah, there's a lot of like survivorship bias fallacy in some of the research, and especially some of the popular research books and things like that, or popular science books based on this. And then so I just want to like make sure we've covered off that first question. So there were kind of two parts to it that we're kind of tackling there. Is motivation a responsibility of a teacher? So my position is yes. We should be like thinking about it as much as we're thinking about instruction, for example. We can dig into more about how those are related in a minute. But the other part of that, the question is one of the assumptions in it. You're saying, should pupils be motivated? There's an assumption there that you're either motivated or not, or that it's a kind of like a general trait. And actually, I'd say that motivation, one of the other things that kind of shines through in the literature, when you look across these, you have to join the dots across the fields and the studies, is that motivation is a much more kind of context specific thing than just a general character trait. So saying, should somebody be motivated or not is not really the right question. The question is like, should we be trying to motivate them towards a particular thing on a particular occasion for a particular reason? And as a result, should we be willing to take some of the kind of unintended consequences in terms of them being perhaps less motivated towards other things? Because I'm not 100% sure about this, but I suspect motivation, a bit like attention, is to a certain degree a zero-sum game. And so we might have to make some sacrifices along the way if we're going to try and increase motivation in certain aspects of our people's lives.
Pretty interesting you say that. In Spain, the verb attached to attention is spend. So you spend attention, and I think that sums it up. In terms of if you're spending your motivation, you have a limited amount of currency to work with, don't you?
Right, absolutely. And I think we have similar kind of metaphor has emerged in English language as well. We talk about paying attention, don't we?
Yeah.
And so like I do think attention is probably effectively or usefully thought of as a currency of the classroom. We certainly, it's usefully thought as a currency on social media these days. It's essentially like Twitter is competing for your attention as Facebook and all the other things in our lives, and we're at a point now where there are just so many things competing for our attention that it's ever more important that we are able to like manage where we place our attention. And I think for me that's really what the mechanism of motivation is a like some kind of mechanism that allows you to well, you've got to be careful, a mechanism that ends up allocating your attention to something. Now, how consciously you are part of that process is a different question, which we come back to.
I believe I never made the connection between spend and paying attention. Slightly embarrassed here. Well, yeah, we've had that phrase for many years.
Yeah, Spanish probably got it from us.
So what does that mean for our practice then?
Right, that pupils should be motivated, or that we should be taking responsibility for them?
I think because my next two questions were about the motivation being something we hadn't cracked, and I think you've covered that, and the inexorable decline. So I think so considering those two ideas, and so I think it was 2017. You wrote that we hadn't cracked it. The first thing you can write, have we cracked it anymore since then? And what should we perhaps be doing in the classroom to sort of try and get the most from the situations that we sort of encounter every day?
Yeah. Okay. So we kind of said that there's a case for doing this, but how might we do it? I think the kind of starting point for this, or the important starting point, is to make that link between motivation and attention. We've kind of like opened that box a little bit already, but it'd be good to like lock that down a little bit. So we've already mentioned that we live in a world where there are multiple things competing for our attention at any one time. And I've said, our current era has more bits of information trying to compete for our attention than ever before. But 20,000 years ago, there's still a lot of information competing for our attention. So things haven't really changed, I suppose, on a macro scale. And we need some kind of way of allocating our attention. So, said this is what a useful way to think about motivation is. But the key here is just to remind ourselves that what we attend to is what we end up thinking about. And as Daniel Willingham has helped us really wrap our heads around, what we think about is what we end up learning. And so this is kind of why motivation is such an important thing for the classroom, is because motivation and attention are linked to a certain extent, and attention is one of the gatekeepers of learning, as it were. So the more attention we pay to a certain object, to a certain thing, the more likely that we will learn it, that will be transferred to our long-term memory and kind of like retained there in a way that becomes useful for us to think about. So that's the kind of first piece, I think, just to kind of like lay out. Once you have that in place, you can start asking the next set of questions, which is, how do we go about influencing this, mechanism that is motivation, to influence the amount of attention that gets paid? And that really, that's a hard question to answer. You got to like really look across the literature pretty hard and just see where common themes come up. And one of the things that, before we dive into the common themes, one of the things that you kind of figure out in this, by trying to answer this question, is that, like I hinted at earlier, a lot of that mechanic operates below a level of our conscious awareness. So, a lot of the time, your brain is basically paying attention to stuff or making decisions about what to pay attention to without consulting you, essentially. It's just doing it of its own accord. And it's doing it very, very quickly as well. It's like, making rapid decisions, weighing up the kind of like the evidence, weighing up the pros and cons, weighing up the values and the costs of these different opportunities, information opportunities available to you, and making very, very quick decisions about like what to pay attention to. And there's good reason for this, because if, for example, we tried to consciously calculate all of the opportunities that are available to us, you're currently like listening to me and Kieran bang on about motivation. However, you also might have like, Twitter nagging away at you if you're like listening to this on your phone, or you might have, dinner coming down the road later on. You might be thinking about what you need to like prepare for that, or there might have been a stressful day today and your brain's like trying to nag you to think about that. All these different like things trying to compete for your attention. If you try to consciously calculate which was the best of those to pay attention to, it would just take you literally months to work out. Is it better to be listening to Peps now, or to be thinking about dinner later, or to be like anxious, like worrying about this thing that happened earlier? It would take weeks to just make that decision. And, of course, at that point, the opportunity would have gone. There's just the opportunity cost of like taking time to make a decision is just too big for us to live effectively. And so basically over like, hundreds and thousands of years, probably longer, to be honest, our brains have evolved this like highly efficient unconscious set of rules of thumb, what are more like formally known as heuristics, that allow us to make very, very fast and frugal decisions about where to place our attention. And it's those rules of thumb that become the interesting question then, like what are these rules of thumb that our brain uses to make these very rapid decisions unbeknownst to us? Because if we can figure them out, and as teachers, if we can kind of harness them, then all of a sudden we can start to like, change the trajectory or change the direction of motivation and attention in the classroom.
It sounds so clear, but like you say, it's a much more complex process than anyone could ever imagine. I often find that a lot of the big questions come back down to how we've evolved over time. As I was doing some stuff on storytelling and on why stories are stickier than others. And I think, the connection between when we evolved the ability to retrieve information and when we evolved language, the sort of the line that I follow, they seem to say they happened at the same time, and so they're inextricably linked. Yeah, so it's fascinating hearing you talk about the connection between our evolution and how we're motivated, because sometimes I know I should do something, but then my body's telling me it's not motivated, so maybe it's making the decision for me.
Yeah, so I think there's loads of examples of this in like our lives, in the present day. That kind of like tension between our evolved architecture and our modern environment is ever more kind of present. You can experience it whenever you have this kind of conflict between wanting to eat chocolate and knowing that it's bad for you longer term. Like, you sometimes like you can, I can definitely speak from experience here, saying that I have made conscious decisions not to eat chocolate or biscuits, and those decisions have been overridden by myself, which is a really strange thing. And that's a really good example of the kind of like those unconscious heuristics being put into play, and also a good example of just how powerful they are. So even though like we rationally have worked out a plan and made a decision around, doing whatever it is, like not eating chocolate, about saying like doing some exercise, about not arguing with people on Twitter, whatever it is, sometimes in the moment, like those unconscious heuristics will just override, like completely just like trample all over those like conscious decisions. And so I think that's like a useful idea to kind of hold in our minds when we're teaching, is that some of what we're doing is actually, harnessing the unconscious here a little bit for the benefit of our pupils.
So would we be better than focusing our attention in class? And I'll try not to get attention too much into it. So like, is it a good bet for us to focus on those strategies that primarily are designed to draw people, like worked examples, for instance, or if you phase a worked example back out, for me, in my mind, they draw attention to particular properties, and essentially that's what they're there for. Are those the kind of things we should focus our attention on in the absence of concrete sort of message from the motivation research community?
Motivation is about determining, like trying to influence the direction of that attention and the magnitude of that attention, which we kind of can equate with effort. Yeah, so that's sort of like, you can what we're doing when we're thinking about motivation is like getting our pupils to like direct their attention towards a particular thing that we're interested in, and continue, like persist with ending to that thing, despite having potentially some like difficulties, or despite there being other things that are competing for their attention. Figuring out what they should be attending to is another massive question, but probably one we're not going to be able to like tackle today. But the worked example pairs is a good example of like a strategy where, as teachers, we're thinking really carefully about what our pupils should pay attention to in order to help them build like a really strong schema so that they understand this stuff. So yes, like in a classroom context, what we're thinking about here is like, how can, if we think that paying attention to these particular, very specific parts of this worked example pair is the right thing to do, which it probably is, then how can we do that? Like, how can we maximize or optimize their attention towards those things? And the answer is we try to like pull over these like levers, these unconscious levers called heuristics, and cross our fingers that'll happen. So what might some of these heuristics be? Well, there's kind of like a group of them that are like fall within the classic economics set. And then there's a group of them that fall within the kind of more modern behavioral economics suite. And so if we just start with the kind of classic economics, like the heuristics, the first is really around, one of the levers is around value, like how valuable is it for us to pay attention to this particular thing? What value will it bring us? And one of the like bits of information our brain uses to determine this is basically looking at our prior success rate. So if you've been successful if people's been successful in your class time and time again, then it's much more likely that they're going to pay attention to whatever you suggest they pay attention to the next time they're in your class. In contrast, if they if they've paid attention to the things you've suggested and they've repeatedly experienced failure, then it makes sense that they're just not, why should they pay attention to this thing again? Because it hasn't delivered value for them in the past. Like, it would be crazy. That would be a maladaptive thing to have evolved, essentially, is like keep doing something where you fail. So like there's good reasons for this, and it makes sense. And the implications for us as teachers are that we just got to try and increase the success rate for our pupils, really. Now, the big thing that we can do to do this is just to teach well. All right. So like the number one message I think around motivation is just teach well. If you teach well, that's probably the biggest thing you can do to increase motivation. Explain clearly, break things down into like manageable chunks, provide lots of opportunities for practice and feedback, all that kind of stuff. However, let's just like assume that that's happening. Obviously, big assumption, lots of stuff we could talk about in terms of like good teaching, but let's just assume there's great teaching going on. There are also some other things that we can do to increase like that feeling of success, because success is actually quite a subjective thing. One pupil's success could be another pupil's failure, really. A pupil in your class could be like doing all of the things that you think they should be doing. They could be like asking questions. They could be trying really hard. They could be bouncing back from like failure. They could be helping their peers. All those kinds of things. But in their head, they might believe that success means getting all of the questions right first in the class. And if that doesn't happen, it's if that experience is a failure for them. And so they'll walk out of that lesson thinking, I've failed. And if they do that time and time again, the next, like their motivation is just going to like decline and decline and decline. And so one of the things we can do as teachers is not only teach well, but frame success, help our pupils understand what it means. Because, they come to the classroom, we're just, we shouldn't just leave it to them to like guess, figure out what success means. We should, help them understand like a good version of success. And so that can just, mean explaining to them really clearly in this classroom, success means, trying really hard, put your hand up when you don't understand, helping your peers, bouncing back when you don't get it, whatever it is that you think success is, so that at least what you're working towards is aligned with kind of what they're experiencing. And that means that over time, it's more likely that if you're teaching well and they have got a good understanding of success, that they're going to start to build like motivation over time. In classical economics, you got classical economics, which basically treats kind of humans as rational actors to a certain extent. We are motivated by value and cost. and expectancy, things like that. Behavioral economics kind of suggests that like rational behavior is a bit more complex than that. There's like a social layer to it as well. So we're just sticking with, if we stick with the classical economics, like levers for the minute. So we've talked a little bit about a value type thing, which is prior success rate, more commonly known as expectancy in the literature. The counter to that, in classic behavioral economics, suggests that we're motivated not only by value, but by the cost of something, like how much effort we have to put in or how much we have to invest in it. If I said to you, look, okay, Mac, here's £1 million, you'd be like, give me it, it's wired over Peps by PayPal, I'm ready to receive it. But if I said, well, actually, to get this, you have to work as a day trader for 14 hours a day for the next 20 years of your life, you might think twice about that, because you're doing like a very sensible cost benefit analysis there, and it might not be that that's a good cost, a good use of your time. Seems true in like any kind of environment, including the classroom. Our pupils are constantly trying to weigh up like, what's the cost here, and does it like measure up to the kind of benefit that I might be getting? The tricky thing here is that in economic studies, what they tend to do is to just try and make things easy. So it's like reduce the cost, make things easy for the consumer or the participant, and that increases their level of motivation. Which in the classroom, we don't really want to just do that, because learning is effortful. And so if you reduce the amount of effort, then you're basically going to reduce the amount of learning that happens. And so you have what's the answer to this conundrum here? And I think one of the answers to this conundrum is routines, because what routines do is they redeploy the amount of attention that gets paid towards something from thinking about like the how to thinking about the what. So let me try and explain this. So the more you do something, the more it becomes a routine. When something becomes a routine, you have to pay less attention to what's happening. And when you pay less attention to the how, the routine, the mechanics of what's happening in the classroom, you're able to pay more attention to the what, the content, to the object of your learning. And so what that means is we kind of get this, we can manufacture this trade-off whereby we are decreasing the amount of attention our pupils have to spend or pay towards like the pedagogy, the how, the process of learning, so that we can maintain or even ramp up the amount of attention they're paying to the thing that they were trying to get them to learn. And as we said earlier, paying attention to the thing makes you think about it, makes you learn it. And so routines are a good example of how we can essentially reduce the cost, which increases the kind of cost benefit equation, which increases the level of motivation. So that's a kind of another example, like a classic economics type lever that we're going to pull.
That was one of my favorite bits of motivated teaching, and it really had a big impact on how I design tasks. And we've actually been using it in early years this year with number bonds. And
right.
So we've sequenced the bonds that we want them to learn from nursery through to the end of reception. And I said to them, let's have 5 stock activities that the pupils know how to engage with, so they can focus on the bonds themselves. So it'll be the mathematics that changes slightly. And then I would do the same. I have a stock set of encounters that I want my pupils to have whenever I'm modeling with my teachers, because then like I say, you can get quite complex. It really stood out to me. And when you're talking now about routines and things, I think in terms of where we're going to sort of focus, not having unique and wonderful in inverted commas tasks for every single lesson is one of the big things that I learned whenever I read motivated teaching.
Yeah, and I'm not I'm not suggesting that we like make all of our lessons really dull and boring and repetitive, but what I think the optimal point is where we have a 80%, a majority of the kind of processes that pupils are engaged in are kind of automated for them, at least, or they understand what's coming, or they're familiar, because otherwise they'll end up spending so much of their attention on what's going on here that they just don't think about the thing. So if we care about learning, then we kind of got to go down that route. But a couple of things. Firstly, you can have like quite a wide repertoire of routines. So we're not saying like every lesson is exactly the same, not at all. You can build your repertoire of routines over time, so that each lesson isn't the same as the last one, but within a month, pupils are gonna experience lots of different things that they recognize. And of course, it's probably a good thing to slip in the odd, like, totally different curveball type approach as well, because again, we want to just keep our pupils sharp and keep things a bit exciting as well. And then last thing to say on this is that routines are not only good for shifting the balance of attention, they're also really good for creating a sense of like security and safety in the classroom. So there's kind of like a knock or a bonus byproduct of going down this route, in that it's actually quite an inclusive strategy as well. Pupils will tend to feel a little bit safer in your classroom, a bit more confident, particularly those who kind of need that confidence and safety the most. Anyway, we've talked a little bit about these, like some of these classic levers, but there are also some more kind of behavioral economics type levers. Behavioral economics pretty much takes like classical economics and layers on this whole kind of like social type layer. And one of the kind of key levers that spills out of that literature is this idea of social norms. And basically, it's like what social norms, the literature around social norms says, is that we are like quite heavily influenced by the behavior and attitudes of others, like more than we think. Basically, it's one of those like pretty unconscious things. We're not always aware of it, but like what other people do, and their attitudes have a big influence on what we end up doing. And I know this or I've felt this in a couple of different ways. For example, when I try to get my son to put his socks on in the morning before he heads off to school, it's hard work, man. It's hard work. Whereas, he heads into his like local primary classroom, and his teacher can have all 30 of them like doing all sorts of like stuff with very little effort. And I think my hypothesis is that a big part of that is, it's not that teacher is like massively more effective than me. I've been a good teacher. Like, I know some of the skills. I think it's because of the social norm. Like, partly a big part of that is the social norm effect. Like, that's how schools manage to operate in this scale, is because as a species we we conform quite heavily to the behavior of others. And so that teacher can't, as long as most people in that classroom are doing that thing, my son's going to feel a really strong compulsion to kind of conform to that group norm. And there's, I think, you talked earlier about the value of taking an evolutionary lens on some of this stuff. And actually, I think there's, this is one of these areas that, the evolutionary explanation can add a little bit of like insight. Just got to be careful about how we do that, because, evolutionary psychology is a domain that's very hard to gather empirical evidence around. We're kind of peering into the past and making a lot of conjecture and building hypotheses. Very hard to prove those things. But one of the kind of hypotheses that we do have is that 20,000 years ago, if we working with other humans in groups was a really important thing, and as a result there was a kind of like evolved trait that meant that those who conformed to the norms of the group, who supported the group and stuck with the kind of like these shared rules, these shared hidden rules, ended up staying within the group and being more successful. Because those who didn't, those who kind of broke the hidden unwritten rules, the norms of the group, could end up being outcast. And 20,000 years ago, the consequences of being outcast were pretty drastic, man. You get eaten by a tiger, or you just die of hunger, because that's one of the things that makes us a bit unique as a species, is that we kind of have to cooperate to survive in many contexts. We're not able to bring ourselves up very well for the first few years of our lives, and there's a bunch of stuff that we need to do together as a group in order to be able to not only survive but flourish. And so as a result, we take that kind of evolve, that mind that we'd evolved over many thousands of years, many millennia, which hasn't changed a lot in the last 200 years, despite society having changed hugely, and we plonk it in this classroom. And what it means is there is, we can kind of, social norms still have a big effect, despite that mechanic not necessarily needing to be in place to survive these days. Anyway, slight aside there, back to the conversation. So what that means for teachers is that what we want to do really is to highlight or raise the visibility of the most desirable social norms within our class or our school. And we can do that by, like, just calling out the most desirable behaviors when we see them, making them as visible, amplifying them as much as possible, like calling out, oh yeah, like Peter's done a great job over there by doing this XYZ, telling stories, in my other class, this is what they did, and this is why it was a benefit to them. In the future, I imagine like showing videos of other pupils who are like, nailing it. And all of those kinds of things can reinforce these messages of what like desirable norms look like. A few other nuances here, like firstly, the more people that are kind of like in line with the norms, the more powerful the effect is. So if you have like 100% of your class aspiring to, learn lots or help out their partners or, ask questions, whatever it is, then the strong compulsion for everyone to like be part of that. If just one person like dissents from that view, if you just got one person who's like, nah, that's not my game, then actually it makes it way easier for other people to not conform as well. So like 100% adoption is a really powerful thing to achieve. Second nuance is that it's best to emphasize what you want to see rather than what you don't want to see. The example I try out every time here is a personal one. Whenever I taught, there were times where I'd come in after having set my pupils some homework, and the time when they didn't do very much of it, I'd come in the next day and say, look, team, loads of you didn't do your homework, sort yourselves out for next time. And the message I'm sending there is the dominant norm in this class is not to do your homework. And as a result, those few people who were doing their homework are now questioning themselves, thinking, oh, am I in danger of like being outcast from this group? I am, not conforming to the social norm. And so, dangerous kind of message to send out to the class there, potentially a counterproductive one. And so always best to emphasize what you want to happen rather than what you don't.
Definitely get that. And I think I was quite lucky in my first school. That was the approach we took to manage behavior, because I've been on both sides of the critical mass, where the critical mass was towards learn as much as possible. And, it's very different when the critical mass is reversed, and
right.
It's very easy not to engage, because then you have to work 5-6 times as hard to get everybody going, when it's the school culture, and you can, and, people say you can feel. Obviously that feeling is born from a lot of hard work established in that culture and those norms, because it makes life so much easier and you can focus on education.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think that's really what culture is in many ways, is just this like, all of these group norms kind of bundled together. And it does, it has a massive effect. And if you like, I think critical mass is a good way of thinking about it. You really want your critical mass to be on the desirable side, because otherwise you really, you're kind of pushing the rock up the hill. That's an example of a behavioral economic type lever. Another one which is kind of closely related to that is this idea of belonging, which you kind of touched on a little bit earlier when we like dived into the evolutionary psychology piece. In that, belonging to a group is actually something we've developed a heuristic around as well, and actually we're like much more motivated to conform to those social norms when we feel we belong to a particular group. If you think about your own context, if you belong to like a sports group or a club or whatever it is, like you feel quite compelled to their social, to like conform to their social norms, compared to like some other group that you're not interested in. You just like that kind of washes over you, and it can be even like can go even further, where you feel you really don't belong to a group, like that just not part of your identity. You can even push back on those norms and resist them. And this is kind of what we end up seeing in adolescence, secondary school. At a certain point, pupils begin actively pushing back because their identity, they're trying to shape this like independent identity, which is an important part of growing up. But one of like the the unfortunate side effects of it is that they rally against like the family group norms and often sort of like school group norms as well. And so you have this really, secondary school around about year 8, you have year 9, you have this like kind of tricky tension that you have to navigate. The way around that, and in general, the way to kind of harness this is just to try and build a sense of belonging in your classes and across your school. But like you've talked about earlier, building that culture, part of culture, I suppose, is norms, but it's also this sense of belonging. And we can do this just by taking like an intentional approach to building belonging, which means making sure everyone feels like they're included. Very basic thing, making sure you know everyone's names and know a little bit about them and all that kind of stuff. And getting their names right. Then there's a piece around like making sure everyone feels a sense of status in that group, in your classroom, in the school. They feel they have a role to play, and they got some kind of responsibility, and they have some kind of like, they get rewarded with what the group achieves, if that makes sense. So, if you do well as a group, if your class like achieves in some kind of sense, whatever it is, academically or just like in the school, that they're recognized as part of that achievement, as like somebody who contributed to the group. And then you can also unite people around a common purpose. And that, like, that can be, you can create whatever it is, common purpose. It'd be like, oh, we want to do really well in our SATs, or it could just be like, we want to learn loads about this, or we just want to be like a really caring group and help each other. Whatever it is, like having a kind of clear-cut group identity, potentially even some rituals that go along with that, creates a stronger sense of belonging. Last thing just to say around belonging is that it is catalyzed quite a lot by feelings of affinity, or like basically like feeling that you have something in common with somebody else. If we, for example, found out that we came from the same country, Kieran, we immediately feel a sense of affinity and a bit more sense of belonging. If we found out the same birthday, then that would increase, etc., etc., etc. And so opportunities to like help your pupils find common ground can be really powerful, like levers in terms of building belonging and motivation in the classroom. And so probably worth doing that every so often is just like giving your pupils a bit of chance to ask each other, what are the things that you're interested in, like what are the things you care about, because if they can find common ground around those things, then it's much more likely they end up like building belonging around those like useful characteristics rather than around more superficial characteristics, which we know, like as humans, that's how we tend to group. And it's not always that helpful in modern society.
Is that how you would dedicate a little bit of time regularly to those less tangible aspects? Because I think things like the sort of the routines that are associated with belonging and the group identity, you could probably control those to a certain extent, but in the ones that you can't, like how people feel affinity for things, it's just little and often opportunities to sort of engage socially with their peers.
Yeah, I think so, and it's quite a sophisticated like play, isn't it? And it's quite far removed from learning about fractions or whatever it is. And so a tricky, if it was me, I wouldn't be spending loads of time on that, but I would be spending a little bit of time on it, like regularly, if that makes sense. A few minutes here and there every week or whatever. And that might take the form of just like creating a structured discussion between your pupils. Or it might just be that you are the one doing the signposting, saying, oh, Peter, Chiara there is like interested in that same thing as you. And so helping, using your knowledge of pupils to like help them like feel a sense of belonging together. I don't know, all this stuff's like fairly, we ain't got any RCTs on this stuff. So it's quite speculative. But I think there are schools out there who have really nailed like culture and belonging and, are doing it in a really powerful way. So I think we can like certainly learn from some of the practices that they have.
When I'm thinking of the primary school, I'm thinking of the playground and, maximizing duty time to have those conversations and to connect pupils together and things, because you get to spend time with them outside of the more formal setting of the classroom. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind with me.
Okay, so let me pick up on the last kind of lever here, then this last heuristic. When you look at the literature around like motivation, one of the themes that recurs is this idea of autonomy. So certainly, like there is a bunch of evidence around how autonomy, like increased autonomy, can increase motivation for adults in the workplace. However, like I had to spend quite a lot of time trying to think hard about how this applied to the classroom and whether it did at all. And I think I like got to a place where I think that autonomy doesn't necessarily, my understanding of like the nuances in the literature is that autonomy doesn't necessarily apply so cleanly to the classroom environment, because autonomy, sort of our choice, only really works when it's meaningful. and pupils don't necessarily always have that meaningful set of choices in the classroom. What do I mean by meaningful choice? Well, like firstly, there's some evidence to suggest that having too many choices is actually not meaningful. You have the like choice paralysis, you can't make a decision and it's not meaningful. So like, where we do have the opportunity to present some like choices to our pupils, then great, but like let's keep those like choices constrained in terms of the number of them. However, more than often, our pupils aren't in the best position to make meaningful choices about what or how they should be learning. Kind of analogy here is like going to your doctor and your doctor saying, hey, what do you think we should be doing with you here? It's like, nah, man, like you're the expert here. Please, can you make the decision for me? And I think the same is true in school. Like teaching and learning is not as natural a phenomena as perhaps we sometimes make it out to be in society. And as a result, a bit like medicine, there's some counterintuitive stuff in there, and it's probably best left to experts to make like the decisions. And then what that means is basically the teachers make executive decisions about like what and how people should be learning. But, and this is the critical bit, but they do invest time in helping pupils to understand the benefits of those decisions for them. And I think there's like kind of a curse of expertise thing here that often happens in that as teachers, it kind of becomes obvious to us over time, like why this thing that we're learning is helpful. Like, why is it helpful to learn fractions, or how we're learning this thing is important. Like doing some quizzing, of course that's important, but actually it's not obvious, definitely not obvious to our pupils. And so we probably just need to like catch ourselves and remind ourselves and take the time to repeatedly communicate like why those things are of benefit to our pupils and bringing those benefits as close as possible to them. Yeah, and so that's the kind of the way I'm currently thinking about autonomy in the classroom playing out.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking about when I first realized self-reporting wasn't an effective sort of research method, or as effective as it possibly as other methods. That was a big day in terms of me understanding what I was reading. And when I think about the classroom, it's like you say, the teacher is there to make those decisions, but certainly articulating your decisions as you're going along. The reason, like you mentioned down when you were on, and memory being the residue and thought and things. I'll say to the pupils, right, okay, you're going to remember what you pay attention to. So if you're paying attention to the squirrel outside, that's what you remember from this lesson. But if you remember this, and sort of like giving them the sort of the lean version of what's going on inside the expert teacher's head, so to speak.
Right, and I love it. That's good, and that's called, that's metacognition, isn't it? Building metacognition to a certain, or an aspect of metacognition. And actually, within the motivation literature, they've even got a word for it called meta motivation. It's like some ridiculous word, but very catchy. And so, what you'd be doing by helping your articulating the decisions you're making around motivation is helping your pupils to build this like meta motivation, which I think is a great gift, because motivation is not only something that people struggle with, but adults struggle with as well, like we talked about earlier in terms of the chocolate and stuff. And so helping your pupils over time to build a stronger understanding of what motivates them will enable them or increase the chances that they're able to achieve their goals whenever they get older, leave school, or even outside of the school context. And that's a really good gift, isn't it? And if I could say to you, well, here's some things you can do to increase the chances of you achieving the goals that you have for yourself, that's an awesome gift, isn't it? Good, relevant topic around New Year, which is when we're recording this, for those people who care.
Yeah, it's probably one of the best gifts you can give people, because you can control the first 14, those 14 school years, what are the first 18 years of their lives, and then after that, it's a big shock when you realize that you're not going to be spoon-fed to the extent that you were during your lessons.
Yeah, exactly. And I think big gifts we can give people, obviously, teaching them loads of stuff, so they have that that knowledge to go out and have agency in the world. But then, secondly to that is giving them the tools to be able to go on and keep learning beyond school. And actually, I wonder whether in the future we'll be thinking about that journey, not just after school, but through the school career, and trying to make it more concerted, joined up effort towards building that kind of metacognition, so that by the time they get to year 11, they've got a large amount of the tools and responsibility in themselves. But yeah, we'll see. It might not be possible.
Really stunning to me from listening is just how complex our job can be sometimes, and actually that you have articulated so succinctly in your books and in the work of the Ambition Institute, it's actually phenomenal, because you've taken really dense and complex subject matter and made it accessible. So I've seen teachers coming through utilizing the materials over the last couple of years, and it's just listening to you now makes it really apparent how difficult a job that must have been. But I want to think that the profession is pretty grateful for.
That's very kind of you to say, Kieran. I'd say that there's a lot of people doing this work. We're in this, I think, in certain ways not, but in certain ways a bit of a golden age in education. We're kind of on this cusp of like professionalizing our work, which is really, really exciting. And there's a whole bunch of people, including yourself, who are like mucking in, sticking their shoulder into this, which is helping to do this like really important work of grappling with what it means to be an evidence-informed practitioner. But I think on the counter side of that, like the reason we're doing this in 2020 is because it is such a complex profession. Medicine worked this out 100 years ago, or at least started to work this out 100 years ago. The reason we're only getting to this point now, or over the last while, is because it is such a complex job. Brain surgeons have it easy. They so do. Like, they're patients. They're operating on brains in a kind of similar way to we are. Actually, we're operating on minds, which is even harder. But we don't even get to like open up the heads and see what's going on. The stuff we operate on is invisible. We have to do it on 30 people at once. And they don't necessarily want to be there. And the only tools that we have are words and images. Like, it's insane, the task that teachers are set. It really is. And so like I think we're only ever going to be able to do a great job of that if we can start to unpack some of the evidence around like some of those invisible processes that are happening within the classroom, as we said before.
So the DFE is one of their advertisements for become a teacher.
Yeah.
Do you think there are wider structural changes in the education system that might hypothetically lead to increased motivation? Or are we better focusing solely on the interaction between student and teacher?
Right, that's a really good question. And so just to be really clear, at this point, I'm going to be starting to drift into my own like opinion and hypotheses. Up until now, I've been kind of leaning heavily on what I've found from reading around the literature over many, many years. But these questions, I think, are new to me. But I'm happy to kick things around with you. Keen to hear your ideas as well. So in terms of like wider structural changes, like what are the questions we might ask? Well, one of the questions we might ask is, what role do exams play in motivation? Gosh, and that's like opening up a whole like even more complex box. From the like a motivation literature, what we might say is that it's not necessarily exams themselves that have a big influence on motivation, but how they are framed and interpreted and felt by pupils. So like one part of that is the kind of level of stakes that are felt. So really, if a pupil feels that an examination is a really high stakes thing, then actually that can inhibit some of their attention and can like lower some of their motivation. So that can have like a negative impact on their performance and learning. Having zero stakes actually is not ideal either. When people feel there are zero stakes attached to a particular performance or a particular test, then they don't put as much effort or attention into it either. So there's this kind of like sweet spot in the middle where you have a kind of like are giving people like the optimal opportunity to learn and perform. What else in terms of exam? So, well, there's this piece around performing for the exam versus like learning stuff that's going to be helpful for you for the rest of your life. Exams are really just a tool that allows us to infer what pupils know, and as a result, placing too much emphasis on the exam rather than the content itself can distract pupils from being motivated towards the content itself. It's a kind of classic example of extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. So if we kind of work towards the exam as being the thing, then actually pupils are more interested in the grade rather than they are the learning. And if that's the case, then there can be all sorts of like effects that come with that. People can focus more on just like giving the test, and they can focus more on just like cramming for it rather than like learning the stuff so they have it in longer term memory. Yeah, all sorts of things like that can be more counterproductive in the long run. And so, okay, so there's one example of like a kind of like wider structural thing for us to be tussling with as a profession around like not necessarily exams themselves, but how we like frame them or situate them in the lives of pupils.
My oldest did the phonics check because obviously they were in lockdown last year in year one, and he had no idea he'd done it. He knew that he came up and said, "How would you say this sound?" Because he got one wrong, and he's all, he still thought he was right. But I know there are children who, in the same situation, will have felt perhaps intense pressure. So it showed me that it is possible for children to go through the exam system without any actual sort of external pressure on them, I think, because when I think about what we've got in primary, I would take out the exams in year two, but I do think having a benchmark at the start and the end of the phase, from that base 9 to 6 is essential, because like you say, it's almost the fairest way to get a measure of how pupils have done against what they've supposedly learned.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think like in my experience, very limited experience of working with schools, I think primary can do or are generally doing a slightly better job of managing that like optimal level of stakes for pupils. It gets harder for secondary schools around GCSEs to manage that, because it's just like there's a big temptation to make to use the exam as a really big like extrinsic motivator. And there's like there's a tricky tension there, because that to a certain extent that can be a really powerful motivator, but what the literature suggests is that if you lean heavily on extrinsic motivators, whenever you like take them away, levels of motivation like can return to baseline essentially, or even worse, they can like return to worse levels. Because what you essentially said is, by using that as an extrinsic motivator, you said like this thing is not as valuable as perhaps it could be, and so we've had to put in place this other thing to increase your value towards it. So it's not that much learning maths isn't as good just for its own sake as perhaps you previously thought. And so Dan Willingham's got some good like rules of thumb around this, in terms of extrinsic motivators like exams or chocolate or bribes or whatever it is, or rewards. It's a case of like use them as little as possible, only when you need to kind of like get pupils to like over the hump or get them started or whatever it is. Use them as little as possible and withdraw them as soon as you can, and try to build those more intrinsic motivators, which are like basically motivation towards the thing that you're trying to get them to learn.
Probably more effort at primary because you're building those intrinsic sort of motivations, but bigger payoff going forward. And if you think about the system as a whole, actually we're doing secondary a favor by instilling this sort of intrinsic motivation, because like you say, once you take them away, the negative effects are sort of quite apparent, aren't they? It's taken us a while to get, because I think the no stakes to low stakes is a distinction. It's taken me 5 years to convince everybody that I'm working with that, I want some stakes here. So we've got the pupils sort of working against themselves. So in the retrieval practice, saying maths, how did you beat your last score? Did you get that question that you got wrong last? That's how we sort of try to square that circle, because it's a difficult, because competition is quite an emotive subject sometimes, I think, in primary schools.
Yeah, really nebulous, like really tricky. And I think what you're doing makes a lot of sense, is like framing competition against yourself, against your prior self rather than others. Because if you set up competition within a group against other people, that is a zero-sum game. Like there is, when somebody wins, somebody's going to lose every time. And sadly, just because of the nature of like variation in like knowledge and working memory and things like that, you're going to end up with some pupils like losing more often than others, and some winning more often than others, and that can have a big impact on the motivation. Like definitely one of the things that we can do is to help pupils think more about success, because this is one of the ways, this is one of the contributing bits of information we use to determine success, we talked about earlier, is like your relative position in the classroom, if you think that's important. Whereas what you're suggesting is that we help, like we can seed that narrative within pupils that actually it's not about like where I am in the class or how I'm doing compared to others, it's how I'm doing compared to my prior self. Then that can be a much more powerful and sustainable like position. Instead of a zero-sum game, that's a positive-sum game. Everyone can win in that game, which can be a really, really powerful thing.
When I think of systemic change, I often think about the autonomy and institutional autonomy that we have in schools. And so if you're thinking, where's Kieran going with this question? I would be happy to reduce the amount of autonomy we had as schools if it increased the consistency of offer to pupils across the system, I think.
It's like a Spider-Man type quote, with great power comes great responsibility. It's like, what you don't want to do is give people loads of autonomy if they don't have the knowledge to be able to, like make wise decisions. And so what you potentially can get is with this increased professionalism within the sector, you can actually start to increase levels of autonomy. But in order to get there, you probably have to have a little bit less autonomy to make sure that everyone gets to that point in the first place. So, again, medicine's a kind of like a useful kind of analogy. Not the same as medicine, but it's a good like mirror to hold up and to force us to think about what we're doing. There is quite a high degree of structure in terms of like how you become a doctor, over a bunch of years, and you have to conform to a bunch of standards and sign up to like code of practice and all those kinds of things. And the way that hospitals operate, there's like high degree of standardization in certain things in order for the healthcare to be able to operate effectively. But then doctors have like quite a high degree of autonomy when it comes to like their professional judgment over the thing that they should have judgment over, the kind of decisions about their patient's health. And so I think in terms of autonomy, there are not just like a blanket more autonomy or less autonomy. I think it's like autonomy in which aspects more or less. I think there's also a really interesting question around the amount of, because we're talking about autonomy isn't just like a flat landscape. It's kind of autonomy may differ in different aspects. Earlier on, we said, like I talked about this like lever in terms of not giving pupils too much autonomy in terms of what or how they learn. However, I think there potentially is like a really interesting experiment to do around giving pupils autonomy in like how much they show up to the learning experience. So, if you look to some developing countries, you see that like the levels of motivation of pupils is sky high because they're, one of the reasons is because they have a choice about whether to go to school. Now, part of that is tied up with the scarce resource and like, the challenge of like getting good education across to everyone. But part of it is, I reckon, definitely tied to this idea that they do have a choice. Whereas in our country, it's like it's mandatory that everyone shows up to school every day. And I question whether there's anything structurally we can do to try and make that at least feel like it's more of a thing they're opting into, because that could potentially build motivation. But I'm not sure whether that's a circle we're ever going to be able to square. But interesting, if we're chucking stuff around, Kieran, might as well throw it out.
No, I hadn't quite thought about, I wasn't necessarily suggesting we take autonomy from the pupils, but more from schools and the system and the system itself. But yeah, that's probably a conversation for another time.
For the pub. That's for the pub.
Yeah. The nature of primary school is that children are often motivated by a desire to impress an authority figure. I think you've touched on that quite a few times already. And this, obviously I've never taught in secondary. I've worked with secondary age pupils. It seems to change, when peer approval takes precedence over adult approval. Do you think primary school should try and avoid motivating children through such moves to appeals to approval? For instance, I'll be very disappointed if you...
Thinking about approval, like social approval, essentially is it's kind of tricky. There's two ways to think of it. The first is thinking about it as a form of extrinsic motivator. So, it's a bit like saying, oh, here's some money or here's some chocolate if you do this. Basically, it's saying, I'll give you some social approval, give you like a little dopamine hit if you do this thing. And so, Willingham's rules would apply here, like use that as little as possible, withdraw as soon as possible, build their motivation towards the maths rather than like you as a teacher, because, at some point you're going to like leave, you're not going to be there. We want them to still be motivated towards the thing. However, like we said earlier, sometimes we just got to use some of those extrinsic motivators to help them get to this point where they're motivated in the first place, to build intrinsic motivation. So not saying like don't use that, just use it judiciously, I suppose, is the correct bit. Now, on the flip side, we've talked earlier on already about this idea of like the power of like groups and approval within groups, and that can help build motivation. So there is like there's like a little bit of a mess here essentially, because what we do know is that we're kind of hardwired to be motivated whenever we feel like we belong to a group, and part of belonging to a group is the group approving of us essentially, or like having approval within the group. But I think that's like a slightly different thing to having approval for like learning maths, if that makes sense. It's like we should definitely be providing signals of approval for people being part of our group in the classroom. Like that should definitely happen. Providing approval for a pupil like doing well in maths is a slightly different thing. So there's a bit of a nuance there. We just gotta like create a bit of distance between.
What's coming to mind whenever you're talking about using your approval sparingly is whenever that's your key driver for managing behavior, I think you run out of currency quite quickly, and those are quite stressful situations to be in terms of the fact that if you're going back to, your personal connection with the pupil and, sort of imploring them to behave, you need those social norms in the classroom really backing you up in the SLT at some point if necessary.
Yeah. I think like Doug Lemov's view or distinction between praise and acknowledgement, I think can be quite helpful here, in that acknowledgements can be a positive reinforcer. It's like helping to build those routines, but it's not necessarily praise. And keeping praise for those times when pupils have really exceeded expectations, and using it spontaneously and perhaps a bit randomly as well, is probably your best bet, rather than overusing or using it consistently or anything like that. I think you're right. The currency it'll lose its value pretty quickly.
Are there any key differences in your views to how motivation should be applied when it comes to adults and children? Are there any key differences?
Fundamentally, no, I don't think so. Like in terms of the architecture of our mind, architecture of our brains, I think there's more that there is common than there is different between adults and pupils. However, there are some differences. Like some of those differences are as big between young pupils and adolescent pupils. So pupils at the start of their school career and pupils at the end of their school career, differences there are probably just as big as between like pupils at the end of their school career and being adults. So some of those are like biological, hormonal. And we've talked, like one of the examples we talked about earlier is, as you go through adolescence, there is this kind of like increased drive to build out an independent identity, which is like probably an evolved feature of our makeup to help us like establish a community that will succeed for us as a group into the future. Young kids at early primary school don't have that kind of same sense, and so there's an example of how like some of the mechanics like play out slightly differently based on age. I think for adults, because adults have a greater level of knowledge about certain things, about like perhaps like how to learn, if they've built that kind of metacognitive and some of that self-regulatory capacity, the autonomy piece can be a bit different, can look a bit different. Like adults can definitely provide adults with more scope for choice and more scope for autonomy. However, on the flip side of that, we know that accountability is still really important. I exercise a lot more when I know that when I like exercise with my training partner, like I will let him down a lot less than if I just like let myself down going out for a run. Similarly, I know if I belong to like a running group, I will end up like turning up to that running group much more often than I would do if I was just going to the gym on my own. So like these factors still have an influence, although there's like having a degree of choice probably has a greater impact as well. So it's this kind of like highly complex thing. And for me, I think it's just about throwing as much spaghetti at the wall as possible in the hope that lots of it sticks. And alongside that, it's what we want to try and achieve is like a desirable state for each of the levers. What I mean by that is, like, for example, if you have like high levels of belonging and high levels of social norms and loads of routines in class, but if the success rate is just like really low all the time, it's not going to work. Like, those things aren't going to happen. And similarly, if pupils are succeeding loads and loads and loads, but actually if they don't feel like they belong to the class, it's going to be really hard for them to sustain the motivation. So like, as much spaghetti at the wall as possible, bring up like as many of those levers to like a decent level as possible. I think that's where you start to get the results. This is one of the reasons why I think that like the evidence around growth mindset is so mixed. I think that like growth mindset is one of the pieces of spaghetti. And so like, it definitely, it can make a difference. We know that there's evidence to suggest that like people's understanding of like the causes of their success, make a difference. However, it's only one small slice of the pie. And so if you like, have got like great growth mindset going, but actually your pupils are not feeling success or not feeling belonging, then it's just not going to happen. And so I think it's really hard to like control all of those variables to be able to like determine how effective that slice of the pie is. And so what's probably better is just to try and get like, this is a terrible analogy, try and get all of the pie as well cooked as possible.
So would it be fair to say then, would you apply those principles to school leadership, so to speak? Because I find that quite a lot of the CPD I've delivered over the last couple of years, I've sort of adopted the same things I'm utilizing in class. So in terms of influencing a school community, of adults, do you reckon it's fair to make that connection?
School leadership, yes. I think, again, teachers are adults, and like we said earlier, share like common cognitive architecture with young people and other people in our species. So I'd say, like, again, a lot of these heuristics are going to work in a school context as well. The autonomy piece is a really tricky one to kind of like square. Again, like, if we're able to provide a bit of a more autonomy to teachers, you're probably going to get a little bit more motivation. But we know that schools work best when there is high degrees of consistency. For example, we talked earlier about social norms. If you have like one set of social norms in classroom A, and next door in classroom B, you've got a completely different set of social norms, then those social norms are going to like actively work against each other and dilute their effects. Whereas if you've got the same social norms in classroom A and B, then their norms, those like effects reinforce each other, and you get this multiplier effect, which is much more positive. And so that's just one example of like lots of reasons why consistency is really important in school. And so like trying to square that like value of consistency versus like the value of autonomy, I think is a really tricky one for school leaders, but great thing to be like playing around with.
Yeah, because Alan and Sims, they open up the teacher gap by saying money isn't the big driver, it's autonomy and for teachers and retention and things, don't they? So yeah, I could see, and it's a very fine line to tread. And I think, one that probably most listeners will be thinking about, certainly the school leaders, how can we do that? But I reckon there's a lot to take from this conversation. Even though we've been talking about pupils, we can still consider, how that might work in adults.
Absolutely. Like, just, like, how do you like help your teachers to feel like they're being successful? A lot of teachers, can walk away from school every day feeling like they failed. Like, and so how, like, framing success, what does it mean to be successful in our school? I think could be a really important thing. Having routines, again, like for teachers, routines are just as like useful for teachers as they are for pupils. Like in the classroom, they allow a teacher to spend less of their cognitive load on the activities happening, so they can spend more of their cognitive load on monitoring and responding to pupils in their class, which is like, the heart of great teaching is like being able to be responsive. And as across a school, if you share a bunch of routines, then again, you see this kind of multiplier effect where, pupils walk into your classroom, they do certain things without you having to invest loads of effort into getting them to do those, which means you can spend more time on like the stuff that's really valuable to them. We're talking about like norms, having strong norms across the staff, in terms of like, wanting to strive really hard for pupils and like good, positive work-life balance norms. I think it's like really like low-hanging fruit for schools. And then that sense of belonging as well. We know, I'm sure lots of your listeners have worked in some schools where they felt like they really belonged to a certain like a group, the whole school, or like, you know, a subset within that school, and how like powerful that can be in terms of their like satisfaction and well-being, and just like, you know, appetite for getting up and doing a great job every day. I think, you know, you can, you know, you take a step back, Kieran, and you look at what you're doing here. You know, you're building a community, and that can help as well in terms of like the motivation of the profession on a more macro scale. You know, bringing people together in your Discord and to listen to the podcast and to talk about these issues. You know, this makes us feel part of something bigger than just your school context or our organization context. And that's, you know, that's a great feeling, and one that, like, certainly for me, gets me up in the morning and keeps me awake at night thinking about all this stuff.
Yeah, and you know, I think Neil Almond, he talked to me about how teaching was his hobby, and a few people have mentioned how that they feel released from the guilt that teaching was also their hobby, because, you know, it doesn't feel like work whenever I'm thinking about doing this kind of stuff. You know, it's really enjoyable, and I like both the education and the tech side as well. You know, but there's definitely a lot of us out there, and if we can share that load, you know, and work together, I think then it's definitely for the betterment of our pupils.
Yeah.
So you could quite possibly be the person who's been most referenced on this podcast. We did 52 episodes in 2021, and, you know, I haven't counted, but your name called quite a lot, you know, because you know, your contribution has been quite, you know, substantial over the last couple of years, you know, and I think your books are a shining example of how edubooks can be done really, really well. Your new book focuses on developing expert teaching. I asked this question to everybody, and I asked this question to Christopher Such, who's had a really popular book released this year about reading. So it's not me being cheeky, but why does the world need this book?
Why is it more like, why do I need to write this book? That's probably yeah. You know, often you write books just to like get them out, just get them off your. It's like in there. I just got to get it out, and you know. So why does the word, like, that's the reason why the book's being written, so to get it out of my mind, to get it out of my brain. But I wouldn't be writing it unless I felt there was some value in there, because there's a lot of stuff in my brain I need to get out in case of, like, you know, what next. So the reason I'm writing this book is because I think we're, you know, earlier on we talked about, I mentioned that I think we're in this kind of golden age for certain aspects of our teaching, certain aspects of teaching of the profession we're not in the golden age for. But I think one of the like parts of the profession we're in a golden age for is around professional development, particularly in the UK. I think we're having some of like the best conversations around PD in the world, and some of like the, you know, reforms that are coming out around the country. You know, definitely not perfect, but I think are really interesting, like experiments, and are grounded in like pretty solid evidence. So like makes me optimistic really about the future of teaching in the UK, or England at least. But one of the things that I feel we haven't quite nailed down yet is kind of like how we can increase the chances that the PD that we do is really impactful. I think there is like emerging evidence around this, but still pretty scant. And crucially, I think we, a bit like with motivation, we kind of lack like an overarching framework at the minute for thinking about PD, like what it is, how it relates to expertise, teacher effectiveness, teacher quality, like how learning fits into it, like you know, what the role of reflection is, what the role of coaching is, what you know, where does deliberate practice fit into it, how important are habits as part of the equation, what about teacher motivation, like, and how do all of these things interrelate, like what's this, like the ideal dosage for PD. You know, I think there are just loads of questions that we don't necessarily have even the language to start to talk about yet, never mind the answers for. And so what I want to try and do with this book, a bit like with motivation book, is to try and provide a bit of a framework that we can start to kick around and start to use as a bit of common language to start to talk about this stuff a little bit more. And of course, drag in as much of the evidence base as possible to support that initial framework, so we have like a decent, robust starting point. The like exciting thing for this book is that, the forthcoming book, is that not only will I be able to draw on like the evidence base that I've been kind of like engaged with over the last maybe 15 years or so, but also be able to like lean on some of my experiences at designing, delivering PD at scale over the last 10 years, I suppose. As like a PGC lecturer, university for 6-7 years, and then the last 5 or so years I've been working for Ambition, like designing programs for lots of different audiences, early career teachers, middle leaders, senior leaders, masters in expert teaching, all these kinds of things. And so I'm hoping that I can take as many of the lessons from literature as possible that line up with the lessons I've learned from my experience at designing PD at scale, and create the kind of Peps thing. It's just a really concise bunch of insights into some of those lessons so that other people can take them and improve on them and kick them around and tell me where I'm wrong and all that kind of stuff.
What's the crossover like with your PhD? Because your thesis is sort of pushing in the same direction. Is the Venn diagram, do they overlap quite a bit?
Not as much as I would like it to be. Writing a PhD is a different beast. It's a different audience. There's probably going to be a couple of people who ever read that, bless them. And it kind of has to. PhD has to be almost mind-numbingly boring, and almost the opposite of concise, in order to be able to be really secure that you're actually moving the kind of knowledge base forward. Whereas the books have to take a much different approach to building really actionable insights in as short a space of time as possible. However, the focus is pretty much or a very similar thing. I want to make sure that whatever I'm thinking about, it's all contributing toward this same goal of helping teachers to get better. And so my PhD is currently focused on essentially what a model of teaching might be that allows us to do teacher education well, basically. So yeah, getting into the weeds around all sorts of stuff around that, which is both good for my professional role in the system to make sure I'm doing things rigorously, but also good for me personally to make me keep learning, Kieran, because it's just as important that I keep developing as a teacher as well.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of moving the profession forward, I don't think anyone's successfully managed to come up with a unifying theory of education or of teaching. So if that were a thing, or certainly if you got anywhere near close to it, it would be massively invaluable to the profession. So yeah, I'll definitely be one of the people reading, because they're all kept in the British Library, aren't they?
Yeah, I do. I think we're a long way off any kind of unified theory, but I think there's been a lack of efforts to try and build anything like that over the last probably 50 years or so. And so I'm keen just to kind of take up that torch again and push it forward, even if it's just a tiny step in the right direction. I'd be really, really happy. Yeah.
The subject of your talk at the Research Ed National Conference was developing expert teaching. So if that talk is anything to go by, then this book will be another phenomenal addition to the canon, the Peps Mccrae canon. So I know that everyone listening will be really looking forward to checking that out as soon as possible.
Great. Well, yeah. Like ever, don't get your hopes up too much. These things take time, but you can pre-order on Amazon. So get in there, and that will book you in, and it definitely will be shipped. It's just a matter of when. These things, I don't like to rush these things, because it's better to produce something really good, even if it takes another 6 months or a year. Quality trumps speed, I think, for me.
Absolutely. And I'm sure people understand you've got quite a lot on your plate, as part of your day job, never mind the things you do in your spare time as well.
Yeah.
So, it's been absolutely fascinating today, Peps. Have you any final advice for listeners who are feeling supercharged and ready to up their motivation game?
Well, I would say, genuinely, I'd say get involved in what you're doing, Kieran. Come and join the Discord channel. Talk to other people about this podcast and other stuff you're learning about. The more you kind of go out and get involved in this stuff, the more you end up feeling like you belong. Even today, me chatting to you makes me feel a little bit more like I belong to this movement, which is a really positive thing. And so there'd be that. And then just, think about those levers, and, nothing changes if you don't do anything differently. So, take some of these ideas back to your classroom and have a play, do a bit of experimentation, see what do you think might work for you. And when you figure stuff out, talk about it to other people, share the love, share the stuff. That's kind of how we have to move forward as a community, is trying stuff out and talking about it regularly.
Every person I interview, I feel a bit more part of the online community too, because avatars are avatars at the end of the day, aren't they? But the more people you talk to in person, the easier it becomes, I think.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for today. I really appreciate it. Well, I know people will find it really useful and worthwhile. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and yeah, look forward to catching up with you guys even more in person, like real life 3D in person at some point.